So years ago, when I was only at the beginning of my anime and manga addiction, I stumbled upon a comment on Manga Updates that said that Shoujo is a form of emotional jerk-off. And I don't even remember the context of that comment, or the user who posted it, but the metaphor was so vivid that it kind of stuck with me years later. I think its author was talking specifically about shoujo romances, and I think they meant how supposedly these kind of stories are meant to make the reader feel really, really good emotionally, because you have that build-up of romantic tension that is then released with a symbolic event such as a kiss or a confession or just the characters finally getting together. Another thing that could have been implied in that comment is how romance stories are this kind of emotional self-stimulation that people engage in because they don't have real romance in their lives, so they don't get to feel the real talkie-talkies instead of the fake ones. So engaging in these fake emotions is essentially self-serving and not productive, because you only do it to make yourself feel good. And there was another interesting post that I saw quite recently actually on the Shoujo subreddit. The author of the post compared shoujo to cheap and low-quality pulp fiction that uses sensationalism to get the reader to feel the thrill of immediate emotions, but offers no deeper meaning beyond that. They say that shoujo focuses on the cute but bland, emotional but kind of fake and empty, and they say it with love. Obviously, we all feel it. And in case you're wondering what is shoujo, shoujo is the kind of Japanese manga and anime that are meant for and marketed towards girls. And like other female-oriented media all across the world, shoujo has always been dismissed as disposable and inconsequential, unlike stuff that's been made for men, obviously. Because girls' culture is by default so silly it only deserves a footnote in history. What I find interesting is that both of those observations sound kind of like the usual critiques of romance as a genre across all media. People like to say that romance is pleasure and thrill-seeking cringe, full of wish fulfillment and predictable tropes. So, at least when it comes to shoujo, it seems like these critiques operate on several automatic assumptions. The first is that shoujo equals romance, and that the kind of romance that is to be found in shoujo is basically the same as in Western romantic narratives, because romance is supposed to be the same across cultures, apparently. Some other automatic assumptions are that romantic narratives only exist to make the reader feel something. Those thrills are almost mechanical in nature and easily reproducible, so the reader, with every new story, is kind of going through the same motions to feel the same things over and over again until they reach their symbolic climax. And that the stories that get the reader to feel any kind of emotions don't have any deeper intellectual meaning to them. They don't have anything new or interesting to say. And while an obvious answer to those critiques would be an advice to just go read more shoujo, because it's really not that difficult to stumble upon shoujo manga that doesn't fit into the kind of definition that both of those comments seem to have in mind. But I'm more interested to explore where those assumptions come from. Is shoujo really merely romance? And if yes, is it really just cheap thrills? What is wrong with emotions, and do emotions really have no deeper meaning? My name is Dinara, and I am a shoujo addict, and I want to first address those assumptions that I just mentioned, and address some of the misconceptions that people seem to have about female-oriented media, and shoujo in particular. Part 1. Is shoujo romance? Well, the first and probably the easiest thing to point out here is that shoujo is not merely romance. Rather, it is the kind of stories that are meant to be enjoyed by girls. And girls enjoy all kinds of stories, of all kinds of genres, which is why shoujo can be romances, but also mysteries, and adventure stories, and comedies, and even horror. But because shoujo is not adapted into animes often, and because it really has a lot of good romances, there is this misconception that shoujo is always romance, or even that shoujo is a fancy Japanese word for romance. In fact, shoujo actually means girl, although that word is not really used anymore in contemporary Japanese. According to Deborah Shamoon, the origins of shoujo manga can be traced to the Japanese girls' culture of the early 20th century that was established around magazines meant for schoolgirls. For these girls, their magazines were a unique private space safe from the pressures of patriarchy that allowed for participation in a community of magazine readers that was focused more on the friendship between girls. Shoujo manga magazines, that appeared much later after the Second World War, became symbolic successors to those pre-war magazines, in the sense that they also were a safe space for girls to decide for themselves what being a girl actually is, as opposed to what girls were seen like through the eyes of men who desire them. Shoujo is a discrete discourse on the social construction of girlhood, created and consumed by girls themselves. So because of that, the images of girls and girlhood in shoujo are very different from those in boys manga, for example. But the visual devices that are used in shoujo manga and the perspective that shoujo narratives offer are quite unique as well. Shoujo and josei manga are produced by women for women, and the gendered demographics label partly shields them from male audiences and their opinions, allowing shoujo manga to become a unique discourse of female perspectives on life. It's a place where women can decide for themselves what aspects of human experience are meaningful and worthy of being depicted. So it's no surprise that the values and fantasies of female audiences are quite different from what's considered to be valuable and meaningful in the men's world. But there is a catch. Even though shoujo manga is created by female authors and is meant for female readers, the editors that run shoujo magazines are predominantly male. So they get to put a filter on female perspectives and decide which ones of them are going to be published, which ones fit into their idea of what girls like. So, because shoujo is what girls like, it's not always romance. Narratives that closely follow a couple's relationship are only a subset of shoujo. But even with that in mind, shoujo romances are quite different from, let's say, Hollywood romances, or even romance novels. Because Western romances are supposed to be packed into a format of a standalone book or a movie, they have to follow very well-researched and standardized formulas, like where the characters meet, get to know each other, fall in love, then have a falling out only to reunite in the end. But even though the Japanese manga market is very much commercial, it's still not as McDonaldized as the Western literature market, which is why we get to see the stories where the characters get together at the very beginning, or where they don't get together at all. Shoujo has no obligations to be romance, so it has the freedom to shift its perspective from romantic narratives, or to look at them from a different perspective. Shoujo's answer to the what girls like question is not romance. According to Jennifer S. the themes of shoujo manga are usually described as ningen kankei, or human relations. On the other hand, Giancarla Unser-Schutz, who did a linguistic analysis of the 10 most popular shoujo and shonen manga, describes shoujo as a genre that is more personal than romance, with a focus on feeling and a connection with and empathy towards both the characters and, to a lesser degree, authors. In other words, shoujo is a character-oriented genre that focuses on empathy and human connection. Shoujo portrays all kinds of relationships between the characters, and even the stories that are more plot-oriented are driven forward by the characters and their relationships rather than outside forces. These relationships can be romantic, but family relationships or friendships also play an important role. Love is just a subtype of a strong emotional connection that can occur between the characters, and it's often a very intense kind of human connection, which is why a romantic narrative can be such a great tool in dissecting the characters, their emotions, their beliefs, their desires, and insecurities. And it's the reason why in so many stories, love can be the biggest catalyst of change within the characters, and sometimes even in their environment, and it makes everyone go mad and silly, which is why it's always fun to read about. Part 2. Shoujo and empathy. So back to our comments. That thrill of immediate emotions that the reader may feel when reading shoujo is caused by empathy that they feel towards the characters. Characters' feelings are so contagious that the reader ends up feeling what they feel. But that is exactly why some people dismiss reading about feelings as cheap thrills or emotional jerk-off. They assume that the only thing that empathic connection is good for is to get the reader to feel things for entertainment, as if the emotional experience of the characters has no value of its own, and definitely no deeper meaning, because feelings are bad and meaningless and corrupting and contagious and self-indulgent, and for a perfectly rational person, feelings shouldn't matter. You should get rid of them or suppress them. You shouldn't let your emotions get the better of you, and you sure as hell shouldn't consume media where characters do the worst thing possible, succumb to their feelings. And yes, I do sound like your typical shoujo romance character that you know is going to be punished for spewing nonsense by falling in love and succumbing to their feelings. Serve them right. Let them suffer. There's a reason why this kind of thinking is so comically familiar to us shoujo readers. Because shoujo is a never-ending dialogue with masculinity sometimes toxic, which is why we have a never-ending supply of male characters that strive to live their lives by fighting down their feelings and discarding them as childish, weak, or just uncool. Some real-life men still consider emotion to be a sign of weakness. They say that a truly strong person would never allow himself to be affected by anything. To them, emotions are the number one enemy of rational thinking, so the right way of dealing with them is just being stronger than them, having thick enough skin, strong enough armor, winning our feelings, controlling them, being anti-fragile. What makes the arcs of these kind of characters so satisfying is that you know they are going to be eventually proven wrong, that they are going to reach a breaking point and become affected, that they are going to discover the value that their emotions have in connecting with other human beings. The logic of shoujo eventually drives its characters to realize that emotions are just inevitable, and that the only way to actually be emotionally strong, to have the courage to be vulnerable, face your emotions head on. And key to rational thinking is not avoiding emotions, but working them out. It's how you cultivate actual resilience. And to work out your emotions, you have to become aware of them first, which is why the emotional experiences of fictional characters sometimes is the deeper meaning. Because by following their journeys, empathizing with them, understanding why they act the way they do, become aware of our own irrational feelings, we become one step closer to working them out. This is why the empathic connection that readers develop towards characters actually matters, why it's a lot more than just cheap thrills for the sake of enjoyment. Another thing that is very important to shoujo is the empathic connection between the characters. Empathy is what helps the characters build and maintain relationships, what makes the connection between them so special. And a lot of conflicts are solved by characters becoming more aware and open about their feelings, by them facing their vulnerability instead of putting up a strong front. In the end, the emotional awareness and the willingness to listen to each other is what brings the characters close, helping them form genuine bonds. And I agree, sometimes the rhetoric that suggests that all problems would be solved if everyone was just considerate and understanding of one another is so absurd that it makes my blood boil. It gets especially irritating with female protagonists who are made to take the role of these all-forgiving angels who always put other people's feelings first, or when she's made to empathize with and understand abusive assholes who clearly don't deserve it. Part 3. The Pains of Empathy. But shoujo's emphasis on empathy and human connection is not always necessarily a good thing. For once, empathy can be quite stressful for the reader. Perhaps you don't want to experience all of the characters' emotions because they are painful. Shoujo storylines are not always comfortable to read. Characters may struggle or even suffer for a while before reaching an understanding, which can be emotionally draining for the readers. Or sometimes the reader is made to empathize with a morally ambiguous character who may seem pitiful and relatable, but does unacceptable, unforgivable things. Engaging with those kinds of characters can be pretty stressful, and while I personally enjoy this kind of stress, I can totally see why other people don't. Empathy can also be stressful because it reminds us of our own personal experiences. Shoujo focuses on all kinds of relationships between people, and I feel like in real life, relationships are everyone's pain point. That old high school friend that you had a falling out with years ago but still remember. A gentle yet awkward relationship that you may have with your sibling. The pain of parental neglect. Or, of course, the experiences of dating that might range from extremely uncomfortable to cringy to just terrifying. All of those insignificant and silly feelings and completely unnecessary memories of your relationships with actual real human beings. All of this sometimes extremely cringy emotional baggage may resurface when you engage with characters whose fictional or emotional experiences somehow remind you of your own. Relationships make everyone vulnerable and uncomfortable in real life, so of course being reminded of them is stressful. But I feel like this stress actually helps us work out those experiences in a safe space of fiction. Because not only do we get to see common conflicts from different points of view, we also get to see them resolve, which for me at least can be quite a cathartic experience. Although I'm not qualified to give you any life advice, and you probably shouldn't trigger traumatic experiences on purpose. But there's also a problem with empathy as a narrative device. Empathic connection between the character and the reader can be pretty difficult to achieve. Sometimes it can be a lot easier to make a good intellectual argument than to depict a compelling emotional experience. There is no right or tried and proven way to make anyone feel anything. Sometimes it can create a gap of some sorts between what the characters are feeling and what the reader or viewer is feeling. Sometimes something Susan King calls empathic inaccuracy occurs, a discordance arising from gaps between an author's intention and the reader's experience of narrative empathy. Or, in other words, a sort of empathic disconnect, when the emotions projected by the author don't reach the reader. Sometimes you find yourself staring at characters, having all those emotional experiences and just not feeling it, not feeling anything. When you see the characters on screen or in a book lose their mind over something and you just don't get it, all you see is the skeleton of a trope. That has a lot to do with writing and characterization, but ultimately, that empathic connection is a very personal and subjective experience. People argue all the time about all the things fiction makes or doesn't make them feel. What might seem like a profound emotional experience to one person can leave another completely unaffected, which makes people argue again and again about why some things are too sentimental and cringy, and others are sweet and wholesome. But that's totally normal, and empathy itself isn't the problem. The problem is how we address our emotional experiences with fiction. It's not a coincidence that shoujo, stories that are written and drawn for girls, have a focus on empathy and emotion, because the same could be said about women's fiction and female-oriented media all over the world. Female writers have always been criticized for being too sentimental and emotional, which is somehow supposed to make them inferior to their more objective male writers. The form and the content of female-oriented media have always been ridiculed as silly and bland but cute. As the user Fringes perfectly puts it, a young man can be a million things: a tortured poet, a starving artist, a dreamer, a hippie, an asshole, brilliant, depressed, thoughtful, controversial, rude. He can also be nothing, if he chooses to, and a million excuses will be made for him. Young women, girls, can only be silly. Our books can only be ridiculous fantasy. Our characters can only be unrealistic and one-dimensional. Our movement, our time, can only be a footnote. Well, I don't want it to be a footnote. Sure, we have to always at least stay critical of things that are marketed towards women and girls. The things we're told girls like. Yes, there is a reason female-oriented media and shoujo in particular focus on empathy and emotion. It probably has something to do with the gender role that is forced on women. In cultures all over the world, girls are taught that they have to be the caretakers, that they have to understand the people around them so that they can serve them better and make them happy. Yes, it's unfair that we can't get away with being loners who don't know how to function in a society. But there's nothing wrong with empathy or love or human connection. We as humans need communities, we need affection, we need to feel like we are connected with others. We crave intimacy, and physical touch. The world doesn't need more power fantasies about getting stronger and saving the world from the bad guys so that you can feel cool and respected. The world is not the Wild West where every man is for himself and only the strongest survive. It's not. Guess what? That's man's fantasy. A fantasy that justifies power hierarchies and keeps everyone unhappy. The world needs more empathy. You are much more likely to encounter a classmate, a colleague, a friend, a stranger, someone who needs your kindness and compassion, than a hypothetical bad guy who you can save the weak and innocent from so that you can look cool and powerful. I feel like everyone on the internet is talking about the epidemics of loneliness because we forgot how to make friends and connect with each other. People whine about how they long to be understood, but then don't make actual effort to understand others themselves. Our selfish societies need stories about selfless empathy. We need Shoujo to save the world. Quite literally. So yeah, take some advice from someone who hasn't left the house in about a month, and go read or watch some Shoujo. I'm going to leave you some recommendations in the credits in case you don't know where to start. Thank you for listening.